There's a moment when you look at someone, maybe a friend, a partner, or even yourself, and you realize something unsettling. Emotional maturity has very little to do with age. A person can grow older, but not deeper. They can learn skills but never learn themselves. They can become capable but remain emotionally fragile. They can appear confident on the outside, while inside, something still feels strangely young. We assume adulthood happens automatically. That time molds you. That age strengthens you. That life experience naturally turns you into someone stable, grounded, self-aware. But time doesn't do that. Time simply passes. Maturity is earned, not granted. And emotional immaturity is not a flaw, it's a form of unfinished development. What makes emotional immaturity so complex is that it does not always look immature. Sometimes it hides behind competence, behind politeness, behind humor, behind avoidance, behind intelligence, behind independence, behind charm. But beneath it all is a part of the person that never got the chance to grow up emotionally. A part that froze, held in place by fear, confusion, or pain. Carl Jung believed that every adult carries a child within them, a younger, unfinished part of the psyche that reacts to the world long after the adult self takes over. This child is not defined by innocence, but by arrested development. It's the version of you that stopped growing because the world became overwhelming. Maybe something hurt too deeply. Maybe you were criticized, ignored, or misunderstood. Maybe you learned early on that expressing emotions was dangerous. Maybe you had no one to guide you through them. Maybe you protected yourself the only way you knew how. This is why emotional immaturity isn't the absence of growth. It's the avoidance of growth. Some people never learned to navigate conflict, so they shut down when confronted. Some never learned how to soothe themselves, so they lash out when overwhelmed. Some never learned to trust others, so they pull away the moment they feel close to someone. Some never learn to set boundaries, so they become people pleasers. Others never learned to receive love, so they sabotage every chance they get. These behaviors are not childish, they are protective. They were learned for survival. But surviving and living are two different things. Growing into emotional adulthood requires something most people spend their lives avoiding: facing themselves. Not the curated self they show the world, not the persona shaped by culture, family, or expectation. The real self underneath all of that, the self that feels, fears, remembers, hides. Emotional immaturity often comes from unprocessed experiences, and unprocessed experiences live in the body like time capsules. A person may be 30 or 40 or 50 years old, but when something triggers an old wound, they react from the age they were when the wound was formed. That's why a grown adult can suddenly behave like a frightened child, or a defensive teenager, or a lost young adult. Their emotional world and their physical age are out of sync. This doesn't happen because people are weak. It happens because emotional development was interrupted. Some were overprotected and never allowed to build resilience. Some were neglected and never learned emotional connection. Some were hurt deeply and never learned safety. Some had to hide themselves to belong. But here's the truth most people miss. Emotional immaturity in adulthood is no longer the child's responsibility. It becomes the adult's responsibility. You are not to blame for the wounds that shaped you, but you are responsible for healing them. Healing begins not with judgment, but with awareness. Awareness of your triggers, awareness of your defenses, awareness of the moments you shut down, or become reactive, or withdraw, or cling, or collapse into old patterns. These reactions do not make you broken, they make you human. They show you exactly where growth is asking to happen. Awareness is painful because it forces you to acknowledge that your reactions are not always aligned with who you want to be. But this pain is not punishment. It is information. It is the beginning of becoming emotionally mature. Emotional adulthood begins when you can pause long enough to see yourself clearly. When you can question your reactions instead of justifying them. When you can take responsibility without shaming yourself. When you can observe your emotions without drowning in them. It is in these small pauses that the child within you begins to grow. The moment you become aware of your patterns is the moment your unconscious becomes conscious, and consciousness is the birthplace of maturity. You gain a choice you never had before, the choice to respond instead of react, to reflect instead of defend, to understand instead of blame. This isn't quick work, it isn't glamorous work, it isn't comfortable work, but it is transformative. It is what turns emotional immaturity into emotional wisdom. It's what allows you to connect more deeply, love more honestly, and live more authentically. We will explore the deeper roots of emotional immaturity in the next session, the hidden patterns that hold people back for decades without ever being named. But before we continue, if this first session helped you see yourself or others more clearly, tap like. It helps more people find this message and it lets me know this kind of content matters to you. Emotional immaturity doesn't begin with one dramatic event. It begins quietly, in the small moments where growth was interrupted, discouraged, or simply never modeled. These interruptions create emotional patterns that follow a person for decades, shaping how they respond to stress, love, conflict, responsibility, and intimacy. And the most surprising part is that many people never realize they are emotionally immature. Not because they refuse to grow, but because they've never been taught to see themselves clearly. The first root of emotional immaturity begins with overprotection. When a child is shielded from discomfort, mistakes, conflict, or responsibility, they may grow up feeling safe, but they do not grow up feeling capable. They learn that someone else will always handle the difficult parts of life. Their emotional muscles remain untested. So later, as adults, they fear failure, avoid challenges, and rely heavily on others for emotional support. It's not because they're lazy or fragile. It's because their development was outsourced. They were protected from life instead of prepared for it. Then there is the root of neglect, which creates the opposite pattern but leads to the same immaturity. When no one guides a child emotionally, they learn the world through loneliness. They develop independence not as a strength, but as a shield. They survive by suppressing their needs, silencing their emotions, handling everything alone. As adults, they appear capable, sometimes even intimidatingly capable, but emotionally, they are disconnected. They struggle with vulnerability, struggle to trust, struggle to lean on others without feeling weak. Their immaturity doesn't look explosive, it looks frozen. They're not unable to feel. They're unable to allow themselves to feel safely. Another powerful root is woundedness. When a child experiences overwhelming emotional pain through rejection, instability, humiliation, conflict, or fear, the psyche often freezes at the point of injury. The child cannot process the experience. So the mind protects itself by halting emotional development around that wound. Years pass, but the emotional part of them remains stuck at the age when the trauma occurred. That's why an adult may react with disproportionate fear, jealousy, insecurity, or anger during certain situations. They are not reacting as their present self, they are reacting as the child who never learned how to handle what happened. This is why emotional immaturity is not random or unpredictable. It is patterned. It is consistent. It appears in the same situations, under the same pressures, at the same emotional triggers. If a person feels abandoned, they may panic. If they feel criticized, they may attack. If they feel controlled, they may rebel. If they feel insecure, they may cling. These responses are not chosen. They are remembered. They represent the emotional age of the hurt child inside the adult. The final root of emotional immaturity comes from inauthenticity. When a child learns that their true self is unacceptable, too emotional, too sensitive, too creative, too quiet, too outspoken, too different, they adapt by becoming someone else. They build a persona designed to meet expectations, win approval, or avoid conflict. They become the version of themselves that feels safest, not the version that feels real. But the true self remains undeveloped. You cannot mature the part of you that you are refusing to acknowledge. As adults, these individuals often struggle with boundaries, self-expression, decision-making, and identity. They feel guilty when they say no, anxious when they express needs, and uncertain about who they truly are. When you look at all these roots together, a powerful truth emerges. Emotional immaturity is not about incompetence, it's about interruption. Something got in the way of natural development. Something prevented the child from learning emotional skills. Something taught them fear instead of understanding. Something silenced them before they became themselves. And because these patterns are unconscious, most people carry them into adulthood without ever questioning them. They think their reactions are personality traits. They think their coping mechanisms are normal. They think their emotional triggers are just how they are. They repeat patterns without realizing they are patterns at all. But awareness changes everything. When you begin to recognize your emotional patterns, you step outside of them. You see them instead of becoming them. You notice the moment your body tenses, your voice rises, your heart races, your thoughts spiral. You notice the inevitability of certain reactions, and in that noticing, a gap appears. A space between stimulus and response, a place where a choice can finally exist. This gap is the birthplace of emotional maturity. Emotional maturity does not mean you never feel triggered. It means you know what your triggers mean. It means you can pause before acting. It means you can move inward instead of outward. It means you understand that the intensity of your feelings does not always reflect the reality of the situation. You begin to separate past from present, fear from truth, protection from connection. Still, it's important to understand that awareness alone is not enough. Awareness opens the door, but walking through it requires commitment. To grow emotionally, a person must take responsibility for their reactions not by blaming themselves, but by understanding themselves. They must learn to soothe their emotions without projecting them. They must learn to communicate without attacking or withdrawing. They must learn to express needs without fear. They must learn to tolerate discomfort, honesty, and vulnerability. This is why emotional maturity is so rare. It demands courage. Not the courage to fight the world, but the courage to face yourself, to look at the parts of you that you've been protecting for years, to confront the patterns you inherited, to acknowledge the feelings you avoided, to take responsibility for the wounds you did not choose. In the final session, we'll explore how emotional maturity is built, how a person moves from emotional reactivity to emotional wisdom, and what it truly means to grow up from the inside out. Before we continue, if this session helped you understand yourself or others more deeply, subscribe to The Quiet Paradox so you don't miss the next part. Emotional immaturity is not a life sentence. It is not fixed, permanent, or unchangeable. It is simply a starting point, an emotional age frozen in time, waiting patiently for the adult self to return and complete what was left unfinished. Growth doesn't begin when life forces you to change. It begins the moment you decide to understand yourself honestly. Most people think emotional maturity is something that happens naturally with age, experience, or hardship. But hardship can harden you just as easily as it can deepen you. Experience can teach you the wrong lessons. Age can make you rigid instead of wise. Maturity doesn't come from what happens to you. It comes from what you choose to learn from it. The first step toward emotional maturity is self-awareness. Not just noticing your emotions, but understanding the meaning behind them. Immature reactions always have a purpose. They protect something vulnerable. They shield something unhealed. They reveal something you were never taught to handle. When you feel triggered, defensive, overwhelmed, or shut down, you are not failing. You are being shown where you still need to grow. People who grow emotionally begin by slowing down. They stop reacting instantly. They pause long enough to examine what is happening inside them. They ask themselves questions instead of making assumptions. Why did this upset me so much? Why did I withdraw? Why did I cling? Why did I feel attacked? Why did I explode? Why does this keep happening? This pause is powerful. It is the beginning of emotional adulthood. It is the moment you become more conscious than reactive. And consciousness is what allows you to rewrite patterns that have controlled you for years. The next step is responsibility. Not blame, not shame, responsibility. Mature people understand that their emotions may not be their fault, but they are their responsibility. They don't project them onto others. They don't punish people for triggering old wounds. They don't expect others to regulate their feelings. They don't rely on external circumstances to maintain internal stability. They take ownership of how they process and express emotion. This doesn't mean suppressing feelings. Suppression is immaturity in disguise. Responsibility means feeling fully, but acting wisely. It means learning to communicate without attacking. It means being honest without cruelty. It means setting boundaries without guilt. It means choosing actions that match your values instead of your impulses. From here, emotional maturity begins to take shape through emotional regulation. Most people think regulation means staying calm, but that's not true. Regulation means making space for emotion rather than being consumed by it. It means grounding yourself, breathing through intensity, naming what you feel, giving yourself moments of stillness before responding. Regulation is the skill that transforms emotional storms into emotional clarity. Next comes vulnerability. This is the part that scares people the most. Immature adults avoid vulnerability because it feels dangerous, exposing, or shameful. But mature adults understand that vulnerability is the foundation of connection. You cannot love or be loved without opening yourself. You cannot grow without admitting what you don't know. You cannot heal without expressing what you feel. Vulnerability does not mean oversharing or collapsing emotionally. It means being honest. It means showing your truth without hiding behind defensiveness or perfection. It means allowing others to meet you where you really are, not where your persona pretends to be. Then comes boundaries. Emotionally immature people struggle with boundaries because they either fear conflict or fear rejection. They say yes when they want to say no. They tolerate things that hurt them. They push people away instead of communicating. But emotional adulthood requires the courage to stand inside your truth. Boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines that protect your well-being and preserve your relationships. A boundary is a declaration of self-respect. As these layers build, awareness, responsibility, regulation, vulnerability, boundaries, something shifts internally. You begin to develop emotional stability. You stop being controlled by triggers. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop interpreting everything as a threat. You stop repeating old patterns unconsciously. Stability is not emotional numbness. It is emotional clarity. It is knowing what you feel and why, and choosing how to handle it. Finally, emotional maturity reveals itself through empathy and compassion. Immature adults struggle to see beyond themselves because their emotional world is dominated by unmet needs. Mature adults can hold both their own emotions and the emotions of others at the same time. They listen without dismissing. They communicate without blaming. They respond without dehumanizing. They recognize that every person carries a story, a wound, a past. This is when relationships begin to change. Conflict becomes easier to navigate. Love becomes deeper. Friendships become healthier. Decisions become clearer. Life becomes more intentional. You stop being pulled by impulses and start being guided by wisdom. Emotional maturity is not perfection. It is integration. It is the ability to connect your past to your present without letting it control your future. It is the willingness to grow even when growth feels uncomfortable. It is the humility to admit you don't have all the answers and the courage to keep learning anyway. It is the quiet strength of taking ownership of your inner world. Some people never reach this stage because they fear what they will find if they look inward. But those who do choose to look, those who commit to understanding themselves, discover a version of maturity that cannot be taken away. It becomes a foundation that supports everything else in their lives. If you've listened to this entire journey, from the roots of emotional immaturity to the path toward emotional adulthood, then you've already taken the first steps. You're not reacting mindlessly. You're not avoiding truth. You're not running from yourself. You're seeking understanding. And that alone places you on a different path from most. Now the real work begins, applying what you've learned, watching yourself carefully, choosing the harder, wiser response, meeting your emotions with patience instead of panic, showing others the same understanding you show yourself, and becoming someone who grows not because life forces you to, but because you choose to. If this final session resonated with you, leave a comment sharing what part of this journey spoke to you the most. Your words might help someone who's going through the same thing.